Ladies and gentlemen, we are back breaking down the last 4 editions of the Rundown by the Running Effect, written by the man himself, Alex Osberg. Alex, welcome back. How you doing, man? Congrats on 4 amazing editions. We're picking up momentum, man.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're starting to get some traction here, and we're seeing that the view counts keep going up and the engagement with the audience keeps going up. So very thankful that we have a loyal audience and they're enjoying what we're putting out there. So it's been fun.
One of my favorite things has been seeing you interact with the readers in the comments. And then also the podcast has, I feel like, similarly had some momentum recently, specifically on YouTube. People will comment below. So if anyone has any comments, any questions, any suggestions for how we can make the newsletter or this podcast series better in the future, or simply just want to have some dialogue below in the comments, please leave a comment. I'll make sure to get to it. And Alex, genius behind the Rundown, writes these amazing pieces. I have little to nothing to do with it, sometimes tweaking a title or two, but my goal is to market it, get it in front of as many people as possible, create greater impact. And so tailoring with a few different strategies. We'll break this edition down next time we do a podcast, but we recently wrote an edition about how, junk food isn't the worst thing as runners. And naturally, as I think we kind of would have thought, Alex got some traction, and I made like a little thread on Threads. And people were going haywire from like, I loved some of the thoughtful like comments, stories behind it. But the funniest was one dude was like, oh, this is why I run, so I can have a beer. And I just commented. And normally I don't engage with that sort of stuff. But I was like, he wrote about, I was like, beer is not the same as donuts, bro. And and people were up in arms that I wasn't supporting beer, which I don't know if you would. I don't know if you're bringing beer to the Saturday long run like you do donuts, but I got a kick out of that.
I am not. There's a funny topic in psychology called moral licensing, where when people do healthy behaviors, if they feel like it gives them the right to do unhealthy behaviors. So it's kind of interesting. Like when people take supplements, like typically the rates of like risky behavior or unhealthy behavior increases at the same time. So there's this whole like kind of, reward circuitry for like, I did this one really hard thing. Now I'm going to reward myself, which I argue in this piece is a great thing to do if it's with good fuel. But people can take that to different extremes, of course. But hey, you'll learn all about why I think donuts after a long run are a good thing next time.
That's fascinating. You'll have to, I'm bookmarking that either for a future edition or to bring it up on a podcast in the future. But bottom line, I love dialoguing with you all. So leave a comment wherever you're listening or on future newsletter editions. Alex will be sure to get to it. But first edition to break down today, most prodigies don't make it. Why early excellence rarely predicts who will last. I found this subject really compelling when I read a book called, I think it was called Range by David Epstein. And I think you break down a lot of those principles in this piece. Most people view the Jakob Ingebrigtsens of the world and say, oh gosh, I wish I was that good at 5 years old. And I think you'd argue in this piece that that's actually not advantageous if you want to make it far in the sport.
Exactly. I think we have this misconception that there's a huge benefit to having a head start when you're young. And, early specialization is considered like your ticket to like the big stage later in life. So, and of course, parents and athletes and coaches are incentivized to try to reach very early success, right? I mean, college scholarships are a thing that can save a family potentially like hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we now have a youth sports industry, a multi-billion-dollar youth sports industry that benefits off of, pay to play leagues and, summer camps that are like, very, expensive and like kids are going to send there at young ages to really try to, hone their craft early on. But if you actually look at the evidence, I think what people want to do is they want to give people like the Olympic program when they're 12 or 13. But what you really should be doing is looking at what was an Olympian doing when they were 12 or 13. And because you start to realize that the same processes that make a good 25-year-old are not the same things that you would do at age 12. So, there's actually a very good argument to be made for delaying specialization. There's a great there's a great example in David Epstein's book, Range. He starts it off with what he calls the Roger versus Tiger debate. Roger Federer, as many people know, became one of the most successful tennis players of all time. And Tiger Woods, his story needs no further introduction of how good he became in the sport. But they had almost polar opposite upbringings. Tiger's dad was a Green Beret and like trained him like he was training like someone in the military from age 2. He appeared on national television before he was like 3 or 4 years old, and he was swinging a golf club. And he logged probably more holes of golf by the age of 10 than most people have by like in their entire life. And to contrast that, Roger Federer grew up playing badminton. He played squash, soccer, and he didn't actually specialize in tennis until he was like a late teenager. And he had this much different sense. And I think the argument that Epstein makes is not that one model is better or worse than the other, but we tend to take the Tiger model and we overgeneralize it. And we assume that because it worked for Tiger, it has to work for everybody. And when you actually like move beyond just two anecdotal pieces of evidence, you start to see that no, actually what's happening is like, if you want to be world class, it actually helps to delay specialization, to have that broad sampling period when you're young and to wait a bit longer. But of course, like it's really hard to do.
I'll be honest. When you just said David Epstein's last name, I had to do a double take and was like, "Oh, who are we talking about here?" So poor guy. I don't think they're related. You write in this piece, we confuse biological maturity with talent. Why do you think most people do this, and what's the real science behind it?
Yeah, there's actually some fascinating evidence. Malcolm Gladwell popularized one of these studies in his book Outlier. If you look at, he looked at a hockey team, and what you start to see is that systems optimize for what they can measure. And in sports, we look at speed, power, like how quickly you can do drills. And when you're young, especially before puberty, what happens is that there's actually this very subtle effect where people born earlier in the year, in aggregate, like when you look at large numbers of people, they actually start to have slight biological advantages just because they're slightly more developed. And so they get this like slight edge on their competition where they're now like being identified by coaches earlier. The sports system is concentrating more resources around them. And they're actually enabling these kids to get further and further along just because they're selected purely by biological maturity instead of actually like how talented they are. And so I would argue that it would probably be beneficial for us as a nation and as a system to actually try to widen the talent funnel and to like make sure that identification can happen later, because unfortunately late bloomers are kind of neglected. And it's just one of those things where we do a great job of identifying the top 5% of talent, but we kind of ignore the bottom 95%. And there's probably a lot of people that get overlooked or aren't selected because of all of these insidious factors behind the scenes. I mean, whether it's financial access to sport, whether it's coaches looking at biological maturity, or whether it's, I would make a good argument that there are some attributes in sport that cannot be measured, like grit, like, your tolerance for boredom, your injury resilience. These are not things that we actually like typically look at face value, but they could actually be extremely predictive of how good you can be in the future. But that's not what youth sports prioritizes and rewards.
Obviously, you can't quantify a specific number for me, unfortunately, but with everything in writing this piece and doing the studying of what the research is behind it, if you had to roughly guesstimate or just like riffed on this question, how many Olympians or successful runners are out there who never became that because they would have been late bloomers and just systems and development and coaches didn't believe in them enough to help them see through their talent? The minute that there wasn't success immediately, they hopped to a sport that wasn't adequate for them.
They're 100% out there. It's hard for me to place a number on it. On a slightly adjacent but related topic, there was a study done, which is interesting to profile, which looked at if junior success predicts master success, right? So like if you're under 18, how likely is it going to be that you're going to be great as like a 40 plus year old? Now, obviously there's not a lot of 40 plus year olds competing in the Olympics, but it's still an interesting, study designed to look at. They took tens of thousands of people. This study was done, I think by a Danish scientist. And what they found is that if you take young kids and then you study them moving forward, and you take older adults who are 40 plus that's still athletic, and you look at where they were as kids, these cohorts are largely distinct. There's only 6% overlap that belong to both groups. In other words, there's only 6 people who were prodigies when they were young and still remain at that level, relatively speaking, as adults. So that's not to say that like young or early advantage doesn't mean anything. It does. Like, I mean, if you're Grant Fisher at age 18 and you break 4 minutes in the mile, you are way more likely to make an Olympic team at 25 than your average Joe off the street. So like there are limitations of how we can extrapolate this information, but it just goes to show that there's kind of this current that's like working against young people. And it's kind of like it's weeding them out through this selection process. And it also makes me think, like, as coaches, like the error rate is shockingly high. Like when you're thinking about recruiting, I think there's a lot of people who rewrite history and they say, hey, like, let's take, a great college athlete, and a college coach will typically say, oh man, like I just knew this guy was going to be good. And I saw that like right the first time I met him. I challenge that every single time because like, I think that's just like hindsight bias. If you actually told someone to like actually bet on it and like put their money where their mouth is, you start to see that there's a lot of people that get full rides that don't really pan out. And there's a lot of people who may have deserved full rides that don't get them. And so this happens all the time in sport. And the talent identification problem is really, really tricky. I don't even have a good solution for it, but I just wanted to kind of comment on that and highlight some of the astounding statistics behind it.
One day when one of your readers from the newsletter reaches out and you get married, you live happily ever after, settle on a ranch somewhere, have a kid or two of your own. What's the ideal in your mind with all the knowledge you have from writing this piece? What's in your mind an ideal, scenario if you had to kind of draw the conclusion of let's say you want to have a kid who's an Olympian, what metrics throughout their childhood would you be pleased by privately that you feel like they're on the right path?
Well, let me first, not to be difficult, but let me first like challenge the premise of the question, because I think if you want your child to be an Olympian from the beginning, you're already trying to project your own life. Like, yeah. Here's the thing, like, and I write about this in the second newsletter that we're talking about here. I'm not a parent, but I've seen a lot of parent-child relationships in the sport. Some have been very healthy, some have not been. And there kind of is a pattern that's emerged, which is that the athletes who last really own the pursuit themselves. And the people who burn out are the ones typically who they inherit it from their parents or other people in their life. And there's a great quote by the psychologist Carl Jung who said, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. And so many parents, I think, try to live like vicariously through their children's accomplishments and success. And I think ultimately that kind of undermines the pursuit itself. So I would just say that, like, I don't think Olympians become Olympians by accident, but the Olympians who are well-adjusted and, mentally healthy, like, I almost feel like sometimes the parents didn't do it by design. And like, they were just there to support the whole way unconditionally. And they provided access. They drove them to practice, but like, they weren't micromanaging their practice schedule or their coaches. And I don't know, people might disagree with that, but I just think you have to put the athlete in the driver's seat. Tactically speaking, that was kind of the psychological premise. I think tactically speaking, you really do want to delay specialization and have that broad sampling period. So play multiple different sports. And like, I would wait, if you're going to specialize in running, I would wait a little bit longer. There's some actually fascinating evidence that we talk about health on this podcast all the time. There was a great study in female athletes. It was observational, an observational study. So it's hard to draw a causal link, but they found that young female athletes who played multiple different sports had much better bone health later in life, because bones actually respond really well to multi-directional loading. They respond well to, high impacts, like in different directions, like I was just saying. And so, if you're just going to run in a straight line and turn left from age 13 onwards, you're actually probably undermining like your skeletal health without really knowing it. So I would just say wait as long as possible. If you can, keep it fun, keep the athlete in the driver's seat. You're most likely to have a successful, potential Olympian later in the future.
My only pushback to your pushback is I said privately as the parent. I think right. Nothing holds you and your wife back from talking behind closed doors, and your kid never knows about it. And the Osberg genes seemingly are pretty darn good with how good you turned out. So we'll circle back on this when your kid's like 8, and we'll see how he or she's doing. It's funny. That question I asked unintentionally did kind of lead us into a lot of the premise of this next edition, delay specialization. When later, the youth sports lie that's costing us future champions. You just spoke extensively on it there, and that's hilarious. The first line, and I did not know this when I asked the first question of the last edition. You say, in his best-selling book, Range, David Epstein, I totally forgot that. So all sorts of corollaries in this piece. What do you think? Because they are kind of along similar lines. What do you think is the biggest difference between most prodigies don't make it and delay specialization when later, and how are they kind of intertwined?
I think one is a logical extension of the next one, right? So I think that, why do most prodigies not make it? One of the underpinnings of how people get selected out of the system is, I think they probably are specializing a little bit too early. maybe they're not in the driver's seat. And I think because of that, you have people who kind of burn out more often than not. So I think this was an attempt for me to say, okay, we know what the statistics say at a broad level. We know that it's very, very hard to stay elite for a long time. And we know that young success doesn't necessarily predict, adult success. And what are some of the reasons behind that? And then how can we combat that from like a design perspective? And so the two design philosophies that I bring up are, delaying specialization and keeping the athlete in the driver's seat. One last thing, which I'll pose this as an interesting question to kind of wrap up this piece before we move on to the next one. I'm Norwegian. I think it's probably come up on the podcast before.
Big time to be Norwegian, by the way.
Great time to be Norwegian. We're recording this during the Winter Olympics, and per usual, they're dominating the medal count for a country that, like, the per capita medal count of Norway is off the charts. Obviously, there's like population of a few million people. And they've had staggering success, not only in winter sport, especially winter sport, but also recently in summer sports. And so it begs the question, like, what are they doing right over there? And interestingly, if you look at the Norwegian sports model, it's governed by something called the Children's Rights in Sport Doctrine, which basically has the premise of, like, children should participate in sport because they enjoy it. A lot of early competitions, they don't even keep score. I don't think they keep score until about age 13. A lot of it's scrimmages. A lot of times parents are encouraged to play with the children, like, and they
the average American dad is up in arms.
right, exactly. And they're able to keep
ref
people
at the 6th grade basketball game.
Oh,
is
I know.
American experience.
100%. And what you see in Norway is that, like, they're able to keep their talent pipeline open way longer. The figures that I saw was that 93% of children play organized sports in Norway. And by contrast, in the US, about 75% quit formal sports, organized sports, by age 13. And so the question I have is, like, you're optimizing for different things. I've already said in the US, we're really, really good at identifying those prodigies and trying to nurture the top 5%. But, like, what if we actually instead wanted to design the sports systems for the middle of the distribution, like for the average person? What if we try to make it a better experience for them? What might happen is we might lose a few prodigies along the way. We might lose a couple of gold medals, but maybe we have, if we're just going to use the running example to make this specific, we might have a couple fewer, like 220 female marathoners, but we might have a boatload more of, 245 female marathoners who love the sport and do it until age 60. And so I don't think one's right or wrong. I think some would consider, neglecting the prodigies a tragedy, and then others would consider that progress. And it's just really an interesting thought experiment, but just kind of closed out the second piece with that.
Yeah, before we fully move on, answer this at whatever length you want to, but we've seen a lot of generational shifts between our parents' generation and, like, Gen Z, our generation. And I feel like our generation, our parents' generation, would characterize as, like, soft or maybe a little too lenient. How do you think that will affect youth sports going forward, where it's my personal opinion, so I'll just speak for me. Our parents' generation was maybe too hard-headed in terms of, like, you do this, you follow through, like, always, stick to this one path. And I feel like our generation, how I see a lot of people raising their kids these days, is, like, the second there's any sort of adversity and the kid wants to drop out, the kid drops out. And I feel like the answer is somewhere in the happy middle.
Yeah, a couple of comments on that. I do think there probably is a perpetual notion of, like, the kids these days syndrome, where every generation, no matter how far back you go, probably always looks down on the younger generation and is just like, man, like, we had to walk to school barefoot uphill both ways in the snow, and, like, look what these kids are doing now. They're so pampered. So I do think that's, like, you're never going to be able to escape that. We're probably going to be saying that about the next generation. You guys
get us go to school in flying cars. We had to drive through traffic.
Yeah. Exactly. There is a good book. Some of the research in this book has been kind of disproven or challenged, but Angela Duckworth wrote a book called Grit, which basically looks at, like, how persistent you can, as a character trait, how persistent are you? And she separates that from physical talent. And she really argues that, like, your ability to stick with something is a defining element in success. And so she has an entire book on this. There's been studies done in military academies, and they're actually able to find some interesting evidence there about how predictive that might be for rates of completion for really, really hard things. So I don't know. I mean, if we look at the societal trends, I think it's undeniable that like more people in our generation are probably not playing sports and are probably alone scrolling or playing video games. And I'm not here to like make a moral judgment. But I think there's so much good things that can come from sport, even if you're not doing it at a high level. Like the gifts that running has given me beyond, the benefits I get to my heart and my lungs and, the times that I can say that I've run, like, it just has given me a lot in life that I wish that everybody can experience. So I think there's so many positives that to getting kids involved in sports and then keeping them there for as long as they desire to be there without hanging up the spikes early.
Alex is kinder than me. I'll make the moral judgment. If you're a parent and your kid's playing Fortnite 4 hours a day, involve them in some club or sport. It'll change their life. I'm totally fine in saying that. The next newsletter, the most common training mistake, the misunderstood relationship between effort and adaptation. Do want to pause us here, Alex, and inform the listener. All these editions are wildly packed with studies and information and images and graphics. The podcast, we can only go through so much in this time period, specifically when we're breaking down 4 or 5 editions. We do our best to make these episodes really dense with as much information as possible. But if you're enjoying what you're listening and you're not subscribed to the newsletter, or you want to go back and read one of these editions, even if you are subscribed, I highly recommend reading the individual pieces we're breaking down, because you're only getting, 30 to 40% of what's actually within the edition itself. So most common training mistake, Alex, what is the most common training mistake that most runners make?
So let me start by telling a quick story, which is how I opened the newsletter. If you have been around a serious runner, I'm around professional, so you take that to the extreme. Anytime you disrupt their weekly cycle and say, we're going to do like one less workout and replace that with an easy run, people are up in arms. Completely up in arms. And I write that I spend an unreasonable amount of time negotiating with the pro runners that I coach about how much hard work they need to do to get better. A truth about elite runners, this describes, I would say, most of them, is that they tend to be insecure overachievers. No amount of hard work is ever going to feel like enough. And we all, I'll include myself in this statement, we have this reflex or this deeply ingrained belief that more is always better. If you're doing well, great. Like, let's keep pouring more hard work on. Like, if you have a bad race, well, the only answer to that question must be more hard work. When the reality is that could be the exact opposite of what you need. And the thing that people have to understand and so often overlook is that improvement doesn't come from hard work alone. It comes from hard work plus adaptation. Hard training is essentially meaningless if your body can't absorb it. I've said before on this podcast many, many times, the only training you benefit from is the training that you recover from. So what's the mistake that people make? The mistake that people make is that they have a tendency to cram in more work than what their body can tolerate. And you have to realize that like there's a world of a difference between standing on the edge of the cliff and falling off of it. And I think a lot of times people don't recognize the consequences of overshooting and going a little bit too far. But the reason this happens all the time is that the same traits that bring an athlete to the top of their game and the top of the sport, the drive, the urgency, the intolerance for wasted days, those very traits are the same ones that push them over the edge. So everyone's greatest, strength is also a flaw in many ways. And hyperfunction and dysfunction oftentimes sit right next to one another in someone's psyche. So that's a problem we can talk about. Like, again, how do you now manage that issue of, the hard work problem, and what is enough and what's the sufficient dose?
I think at its core, the biggest problem is how athletes view getting better. And if I've taken one lesson away from all the successful athletes I've talked to, as well as hearing what's made them injured or have seasons or years of struggles and failures, or talking to you extensively throughout the years, or a lot of recent coaches like Patrick Kenner, that episode should be out soon, and Coach Hobbs Kessler to world record, Jack Mullaney, the coach of Niwot when his team went back-to-back winning NXN. It's like the training, yes, they go really hard when it's time to go hard a few times a year, but it's training that they know is manageable and sustainable and will keep them healthy. And consistency seems to be the highest predictor of success, rather than like a few really good months of playing at the razor's edge and then falling off the cliff.
Yep.
Because when you said that analogy, my mind goes to like, okay, if you're right at the cliff, it's like maybe you're really sore and you need to back off or like adjust the workout a little bit. Falling off the cliff is like a stress fracture and you're out for 8 weeks. And that's a
Right.
very fine line. So how would you view almost the core principle of like what are athletes asking themselves about what makes them successful? Because I almost feel like it influences the training mistakes that people make. They train too hard because of the ego issue, because they think something
Right.
will make them good that won't actually make them good. Doing more
Right.
won't always make you better, at least for a hyper serious runner that's listening, generally speaking.
Exactly. Let me bring up an analogy that was very popular, and a lot of people commented on this in the newsletter. There's the dose response curve, which you have to go look at and go click into the newsletter to look at that. That's interesting. Where I compare the dose of hard training to like how you would prescribe medication, and there's a lot of similarities there. But one thing that I think is really important is that absorption is the constraint of training, right? Again, you can do as much hard work as you want, but if you can't absorb that work, it doesn't mean anything. And the analogy that I use is, imagine you take a sponge that's dry, you dunk it in water and squeeze it, which is the same thing as what you would do for a hard workout, and then you remove it. If you then dunk that sponge in and try to absorb more water afterwards, you can't. Like, it's already fully saturated. You've already saturated the pathways for improvement on, like, well, now I'm mixing metaphors here, but like, you've saturated the pathways for improvement in sport and you've saturated that sponge. The only way to actually then resaturate that sponge and absorb water is to then give yourself that period of rest where you actually take the time off and then allow yourself to absorb that work again. So I think so many times people wonder like, okay, how much hard work should I do? And they're so terrified of underdosing and doing too little that they overshoot and almost always land in the toxic zone and do too much. And the irony that so many people can't necessarily understand is that backing off, spacing the sessions out appropriately, and lowering the dose and doing sustainable training that allows you to be consistent over time often produces more adaptation and not less. And that's just like a very counterintuitive truth for a lot of runners. The last thing I'll add is that a lot of runners feel like, well, I think we do a bad job of glamorizing fatigue. And we paint this picture of like, you should be walking around like with heavy legs and you're really sore, and that's proof of work. And it is in the short term. Like, don't get me wrong. Elite athletes and serious runners need to have a high tolerance for discomfort within a session. And yes, if you do something really hard, you should be feeling tired and sluggish for maybe a day or two. But like, when we take that rule and we overgeneralize it once again, and we say, oh, it's okay to feel tired all the time. Like, I'm okay being utterly exhausted because like I'll cash this check like when I get to the taper. That doesn't happen very often. If you think about your own training, and this is to the listeners listening right now, or you think about other people out there who have done very well in training, how many people actually are successful after blocks of time where they're utterly exhausted? I don't think it happens that often. And so what I think you should strive for is the people who have good training blocks, which then lead to good racing blocks, is you should aim to feel pretty good most of the time. You should have an appetite for hard work. You should be winning most of your workouts, because I think that feeling good says something more than just the psychological message. I think feeling good is actually a proxy for adaptation in the body. It means you're getting better. It means you're absorbing the work. And, again, the people who are utterly exhausted all the time, like, probably aren't going to be racing well. Maybe there's a few outliers, but it's certainly not the norm.
And even knowing about some of the training of some of your athletes, like Charles Hicks, one of the best marathoners in America at the moment. I think he's running Boston coming up here shortly. Does ridiculous quantity of work, but that guy, you're the coach, you tell me. I think he doubles like a lot of days, of workouts or just a lot of days in general. And it's like, not that most people should be doubling, but if you can run an easy 4 or 5 miles and not feel utterly trashed after a workout, okay. If a professional runner is doing that, you yourself as an amateur probably shouldn't be struggling to get through your run like 2 days later. Like, professionals are literally running that same day. And to that point, I think I know what you're going to say, but I want to ask you this question anyways. When we talk about the margins in training that will relate to the margins in their races or competitions, wouldn't you agree that that is a conversation that should only happen at the highest level of the sport? In my opinion, I don't think you should be looking for the razor's edge until you're a professional runner. And I actually think this is backed up by your former college coach, Chris Miltenberg, who literally held back Parker Wolf and Ethan Strand. They objectively could have been faster in college. and he didn't even want to go down that route because he knew they had a professional career in front of them.
Yeah.
Like if you're a high
100%.
schooler, you should not be trying to find the razor's edge. You should be finding a limit that you are growing and progressing at, and yes, working hard, but I don't think it's worth it. And I don't think it's worth a few seconds in the mile to, put the risk of having 2 years of stress fracture cycles.
Yeah. One of these things that's easy to say, harder to do. But I do very, very strongly believe in the philosophy that you should leave some meat on the bone. Like, I think the best athletes who have been able to progress through high school, college, and then potentially into the professional ranks, they leave some room for growth. And so, like, you don't want to be at your ceiling too young. And so if that means strategically holding back a little bit and doing a little less than what your ego wants you to do, I think that would ultimately be a good thing. The risk tolerance when you become a professional runner does change. Like, the risk reward ratio is totally different. Like, this is your livelihood. Like, unfortunately, you're going to be forgotten about if you're like 15th at USA's. Like, you're going for medals, and if you're signing a professional contract, like, most people think they at least have a fighting chance to maybe make a team. And so at that point in time, you want to leave no stone unturned, but I would not use that developmental strategy until you get to the professional level or the highest rankings of the NCAA.
Noted. Moving forward, final edition to break down is kind of a part 1, part 2, but we're going to summarize it in one edition. It's pretty heavily packed with a lot of studies, but also like applicable, real world exercises that you can do if you're in the group that we talk about, which I really like that you did. A runner's guide to tendon health, part 1 and 2, understanding the biology behind pain, stiffness, and performance. Let's start with a story, Alex, because a few years ago, it was crazy. It's hard to believe. 3 years ago, coming up this fall, you trained me for my first marathon. Training was going really, really well. And then I had a lot of Achilles soreness, I think, was the issue, some like shin pain, mostly related around the Achilles. And it's cool because a lot of the things you write about in these pieces, I was like, oh, I did that 3 years ago. Alex had me do that.
Yeah.
How much do you remember those days and actually doing some studying of these subjects for me? I remember you're like, oh, I did this for Sean McGorty. You should try this out.
Yeah. Well, let's break it down. So tendon health is kind of an interesting topic because runners know that volume and intensity are the two things that make their heart stronger, their lungs stronger, and their muscles stronger. But tendons kind of have some unique personality traits. And in order to figure out how to make tendons stronger, how to rehab them effectively, and how to make sure that you're not necessarily overdoing it, you have to understand those personality traits. So I would highly encourage everyone to kind of go through these articles and look at the studies and look at the diagrams. I want to talk about 2 examples here that are really, really relevant and really applied, for the audience. And then I think we can dive into any other detail that you want to go into. But the first kind of quirky personality trait of tendons, and remember, tendons are something that connects a muscle to a bone. So like common tendon injuries are the Achilles tendon, which runs from the gastrocnemius and the soleus down to the heel, which is the calcaneus bone. And then another one would be like, distal hamstring or proximal hamstring. Tendinopathy is a common problem. So like lower hamstring pain or upper hamstring pain. Tendons have this like difficult role of connecting a very stretchy and compliant thing, which is muscle, to something that's hard and calcified, which is bone. And if you were to talk to any engineer and you're like, try to connect something that is like, what do I write here? If you try to connect something that's like soft and compliant with something that's rigid, it's very, very difficult. It's always going to fail at the interface. So wherever those things are connecting, that's going to be where things fail. And that's why we have so many tendon problems. So anyway, going into the 2 tendon issues that I talk about, the first is the refractory rule, which is that tendons respond to very short periods of loading, and then they kind of become deaf to further stimulus. So Keith Barr, who's a researcher who I highlight constantly in this piece, he's a phenomenal world-class researcher out of UC Davis who looks at tendon health, and he engineers ligaments and loads them in different ways to figure out what's the best way to do it. Keith Barr would say that tendons are like moody teenagers. They'll give you about 10 minutes of attention, and then they're going to completely tune you out. So what does this mean? So they've actually done studies where they've stressed tendons continuously, these engineered ligaments, they've stretched them continuously for very long periods of time. And then they've also done intermittent loading paradigms where like you stress a tendon, you give it a rest, you stress a tendon, you give it a rest. And what they have found through lots and lots of research is that tendons respond maximally to about about 10 minutes of loading. So that's like, they're really receptive to that. And then any point you go beyond 10 minutes, you're mostly accumulating strain and fatigue, and you're really losing that adaptive signal. Now, once you've kind of gotten that first loading bout in, it takes about 6 hours at a minimum before that tissue is then receptive to loading again. So if you were to load prematurely, if you were to like load a tendon and then wait and then load it again 4 hours later, you're not getting the maximal effect because you're still in this refractory period. So what this means for people who are dealing with tendon problems and they're trying to rehab them and make them stronger is small bouts of tendon loading separated by 6 hours are almost always superior to long continuous bouts of loading. So that's really important. The second thing is that the type of loading matters a lot. There's this concept in tendon health called stress shielding, which is whenever you have a tendon injury, tendons are made up of these collagen fibrils. The injury itself is these disorganized jumbles of collagen that are really unorganized, and load can't move through that area effectively. What a lot of people don't understand is that tendons don't just respond and heal to rest like a bone would, for instance. Tendons actually need load to be therapeutic. You actually have to stretch that tendon and put load through it in order for those collagen fibers to realign properly. So what happens is that the loading that most runners do is they do these little micro impacts, right? You're just hitting the ground once for like milliseconds and then bouncing off. And what happens is you have this effect called stress shielding. When you load a tendon quickly, you actually have load that it actually like goes around the injured area, but not through it. And the hack that has been found through research is that if you actually load something very slowly, so anyone who's had an Achilles injury maybe has heard of this thing called an eccentric protocol or an isometric protocol, where you're very, very slowly lowering your heel to the ground, and then you're coming up, and then you're slowly lowering your heel to the ground. That's slow loading. I won't go into the science on the podcast here, but I write about it in the piece. It's called viscoelasticity. That actually allows the tendon tissue around the injured area to relax, and you're actually then able to load through the injured tissue. So just going out and hammering runs, expecting a tendon to heal, almost always backfires. You have to have a structured loading program that not only respects the timelines I mentioned, so the 10-minute rule and the 6-hour rule, but also has different types of loading than running, namely eccentric protocols or isometric protocols, where you're really slowly loading that tissue.
Well, I'm ready for you to hand out degrees to me and the listeners who graduated from the Alex Osberg School of Physical Therapy. I love it, man. I love it. A very practical question for you, just off of the newsletter. I myself have struggled with Achilles issues all throughout the years. I know tons of people who have. Quick yes or no question. Would you say that like most runners, have struggled with some, would you say Achilles is one of the most common running injuries?
Yes.
Yeah,
it is.
I feel like I hear it all the time. What can people do before we even have to get to this conversation? So you talk to a lot of people who have gone through Achilles stuff or are going through Achilles stuff, but what preventative measures can we take so that we don't even have to go through these protocols in the first place?
Yeah, great question. So I would think that everyone out here who has any susceptibility to soft tissue injuries, which is quite frankly most runners, should be doing some kind of calf loading protocols. And so if you go into the newsletter, I talk about, this is the newsletter called A Runner's Guide to Tendon Health Part 2. There's a little section in here where I actually have a 10-minute long-term Achilles health protocol, which is basically weighted calf raises and drops, where you're doing about 10 minutes of loading at 70 to 85% of 1 rep max. And that is something that you can insert into your program proactively to keep these tissues really, really healthy. Again, it's that slow loading, which is different than running, which is really, really good for keeping that tissue healthy. Not only the tendon itself, but also the muscle interface where it connects, is really good. Let me bring up one other thing, just because I think this is extremely important to runners in the audience.
Go for it.
It's this idea that, and I've already kind of hinted at this, it's that tendons actually don't respond all that well to rest. And so there's actually, it sounds kind of crazy for me to be saying this, because I'm always talking about you should know how to rest, you should make sure recovery is prioritized. But if you actually take a tendon that's injured and you immobilize it and you don't do anything, it's not going to get better, and it's probably going to get weaker, and you're going to start losing collagen volume almost on a daily basis after a few days. And there was this fascinating study done out of Denmark, where they took athletes who, I'm trying to remember what who had sustained some kind of tendon injury, and they took one group and they started loading after, let's see, started loading after 2 days. So they did very like light and controlled loading movements after 2 days, and then in a second group they waited until 9 days to start loading. So really only the difference of about a week. And what happens is that the early loading group was actually able to return to sport on an average 3 weeks faster than the late loading group. And there was also a really interesting study done during the NFL lockout in, I believe, 2011. So if you look at the NFL data, there's actually on average like one Achilles rupture on a monthly basis. But in 2011, during the lockout, which I think was from about March to August, what you had was you had team facilities that were closed. So you had these athletes who were like probably spending a little more time on the couch.
What was going on in 2011?
I don't even remember. I don't. It was probably like a.
Like, was there?
It was
COVID
probably something about
on?
money.
Okay.
I don't know. Something about money.
Makes sense.
Someone in the audience is going to know exactly what I'm talking about. I just know the science behind the study. I have no idea what the premise of the lockout was. Anyway, so these football players for several months were not loading their tissues as much as they normally do. They're not doing their structured weight training program. And what happens is that there was, like I said, on average, one Achilles rupture per month. The month after the NFL lockout, when everyone returned to play again, there were 12 Achilles ruptures in that 1 month, which is just incredible to think about. Yeah.
It's crazy.
If you look at the newsletter, I reference a study and I link to it, which is just a fascinating case study to show that like you have to be loading it. You have to be loading your tendons in order for them to stay strong.
Again, asking you questions off of the piece, not directly in the piece. Can't give away all the birthday cake. People have to go do the work and read the additions themselves. How do you think about, and you may have written about this, I don't think you did. How do you think about spikes in relation to soft tissue, tendon issues, and injuries? A lot of people, I think you've told me studies before, one of the biggest culprits of people getting injured is introducing spikes too early, sessions and spikes. But I've also heard people talk about, that's actually one of the ways you can actually strengthen your tendons because you're using more of those muscles. You just have to do it in an appropriate manner.
Yeah, I'll caveat this by saying I'm not a physical therapist, and they probably will have maybe a slightly different perspective. But what I've seen in practice is that, first of all, if you have an Achilles injury, a lot of times a PT, this happened to me when I was younger, will give you a little heel lift, because when you're in like a zero drop shoe, which essentially is what a spike is, a lot of times the tendon is sitting in a lengthened position while you're just standing there, and you're actually like stretching it a bit more in an uncomfortable way. So a trainer basically I bring that up to say that a trainer versus a spike is putting the foot in a different anatomical position, which is stretching the Achilles differently. The overarching principle here is not necessarily that spikes are dangerous, but that any kind of rapid change in footwear is probably very risky. So what I recommend is that if you're going into a competitive season and you haven't worn spikes yet, start introducing them in small bouts. One thing we did in college with Coach Milt was every Monday before we started racing, we would spike up and we would just do like 80 to 120 meter strides in spikes. The total cumulative volume was probably like 800 meters of work total, but like it was a good gradual introduction into that type of footwear, so that it was kind of this phased in approach where like when we got closer to racing, we just kept putting on spikes on a week to week basis. I think if you put on spikes for the first time on race day, you're not automatically going to get injured by any means, but it probably does put you at heightened risk.
And I can say, as someone who did that once in the past, the long run the next day is not going to feel too fun.
No.
Your calves and your Achilles are going to be a little bit on fire, and that's how eventually you can get injured. Rarely are injuries these one-off moments. They're almost always these build-ups. You'll be sore the next day after a race, and then that Wednesday you'll go a little too hard in your workout. It'll be too much load. I'm talking out of my ass sitting across next from you anytime I make these analogies, but I think I'm technically correct.
No, you are correct on that one. Absolutely. Yeah.
For me, guys, whenever I'm across Alex and I'm trying to make a point, it's like shooting a half court shot. It's like sometimes you'll nail that analogy, other times you'll look like a fool. Alex, any big takeaways from this piece? And again, I've never seen on the internet two pieces that summarize Achilles health as well as these do. So if you have struggled with Achilles injuries in the past, if you're going through one, or even you want to anticipate one, I highly recommend these. So Alex, final takeaway from these two pieces.
I think it's that with tendon loading, and this kind of hits on a common theme that we talked about as well in the training mistake article. Some of these truths are counterintuitive. Like when I learned these hacks, these health hacks about Achilles or tendon health more broadly, I was like, wait a minute. It's like just someone told me a secret that was like hiding in plain sight. And I was like, why do more people not know that like you shouldn't load tendons for 30 minutes straight? You should do these intermittent loading bouts. And like, although it's counterintuitive, rest is not actually what a tendon needs. You do need controlled loading as soon as is possible. And so I just find that knowledge is power. And researching and engaging with this material, I felt has given me a massive advantage on like my competition when I was competing, and then hopefully, you know, a competitive advantage as a coach now when advising athletes. And so I just love learning about the science, and I love translating it into an applicable format for everyone listening today and everybody reading. And so it's really probably just I would implore the audience to, like, you know, develop a love for science, because you're going to find some secrets that are hiding in plain sight, and they're potentially going to be transformative.
And one final point here, when you were talking about rest isn't always the best thing, I remember, and it may have even been before I started the podcast, part of how our relationship grew is I'd, you know, ask you every question in the book about my training, because I was trying to be great at the time. And I never had any stress fractures that I knew of in high school, but I would have all these small niggles pop up, a lot of Achilles stuff. And you were one of the guys who I was like, I took 3 weeks off, or like some stupid amount of time off, 5 days off, ran, 5 days off, ran, and it's not getting better. And there were multiple injuries in high school that you were just like, well, just, you know, try running for a few days, lightly, not fast, not far, but like try putting some load on it. And it was crazy how miraculously things got fixed by doing the very thing that I thought I shouldn't do. Obviously, you have to do it in a very controlled manner. You have to take into account how you're feeling afterwards.
Yes.
But it's counterintuitive with soft tissue issues. The protocol, I think you would agree, is rapidly and wildly different than stress fracture injuries. And a lot of times we treat them the same.
They're very different. The way you heal a bone and the way you heal a tendon are extremely different, and you have to respect that difference. That will have to be a future newsletter, because, you know, I'm kind of I have a very personal interest in bone health, and there's definitely some parameters and some guidelines to follow there. So stay tuned.
Well, this was a great discussion, great edition, recapping the last 5 editions of the Rundown by the Running Effect. New editions come out every single Thursday, free in your inbox. I think 8:30 a.m. EST is when Alex schedules them for.
Yep.
And then every month we break it down on the podcast. If you listen and you're not subscribed, first link in the show notes. I highly recommend you do so. Alex, I know you have a flight to catch, so go catch your flight, go enjoy some skiing, and appreciate you as always, man.
Thanks, Tom. It's been a pleasure.